My name is Lena Willard, and if there was one thing I valued more than peace and quiet, it was the 10 acres of woodland I inherited from my grandfather. He was a stubborn, brilliant man with a dry sense of humor and an obsession with paperwork. Where other old-timers collected baseball cards, my grandfather collected property deeds, and he made sure every inch of land he owned had a documented boundary, easement, and historical record attached. When he passed away, the stack of leather-bound folders he left behind looked like the archives of a courthouse. At the time, I didn't know those papers would become my greatest weapon. When I built my small cabin near the creek, I fell in love with the isolation, the kind where you could sit on your porch and only hear wildlife. So when a gated community started development about a mile away, I barely reacted. People could build where they wanted. It wasn't any concern of mine. That development called itself Deer Run Lakes HOA, a name that sounded peaceful but carried the same tone every self-appointed suburban kingdom carried, polished, restrictive, and full of rules nobody asked for. At first, everything was quiet. I'd occasionally see trucks passing down the public road, never bothering me. Then one morning, while I was rolling out gravel to repair the worn path leading to my cabin, a black SUV pulled up. 3 people stepped out wearing matching polo shirts with the HOA, a Goa silver deer's head with ivy circling its antlers. A tall, square-jawed man in mirrored sunglasses approached me like he was walking onto a battlefield. "Good morning," he said, in a voice that wasn't actually friendly. "I'm Clay Foster, elected HOA president of Deer Run Lakes. We need to discuss the private road connecting through your property. We'll be using it as an access route for our residents." I wiped sweat from my forehead. "That road doesn't connect to your development? It stops at my land." He smiled like I was amusingly uninformed. "Right, for now. We're planning a south expansion in the upcoming year. We'd like your consent, and if I don't give it?" I asked. A woman beside him, blonde bun, clipboard, resting superiority face, jumped in. "Well, it's in the community interest. It benefits the area. Surely you understand collaboration." I leaned on my shovel. "No." Silence. Clay didn't blink. The woman scribbled something dramatically on her paper like I had just signed a confession. Another man with a tablet cleared his throat. "We assumed it wouldn't be an issue. The previous surveys show old logging paths through here. So historically speaking, it's been used by others." I raised an eyebrow. "Logging companies leased access from my grandfather. Check again." They exchanged glances. They were used to people folding, maybe even intimidated by matching shirts and jargon. I wasn't. Clay put his glasses on the top of his head, leaning closer. "Lena, I hope you'll reconsider. Things move smoother when neighbors cooperate." "Clay," I replied just as evenly, "this land has been in my family since 1924. We didn't cooperate to keep it." They left with stiff smiles and disappointed eyebrows. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Within a week, survey flags appeared on my road, neon red plastic squares dancing mockingly in the wind. A few days later, I caught a contractor's cutting brush near my fence. I marched over. "You're on private property." The foreman barely looked up. HOA hired us to prep for widening the road. They said they'd handle permissions. I pointed at him. "You step another foot past that tree line, and we'll let the sheriff sort out permissions." They left, grumbling. Then came the letter stamped, official-looking, filled with legal phrases and empty threats. The HOA claimed they were reviewing an access necessity for community enhancement. Their argument, because my private road could benefit them, denying it was obstruction. I burned one letter in my fire pit out of spite. I used the others as kindling. Things escalated when I found clay tire tracks cutting around my gate. Someone had driven through the brush and onto my road anyway. I checked the footprint treads and saw the same make and width of the HOA president's SUV. That's when I stopped reacting emotionally and started reacting like my grandfather would with paperwork. I spent a full weekend digging through those old leather-bound deed folders. And because my grandfather had been meticulous, not only did I find the original land patent, but also a map of the discontinued logging route, a handwritten contract proving temporary access was leased, and several letters where my grandfather explicitly denied a land purchase request from a developer's ancestor 50 years earlier. This wasn't just private land. This was documented, historically reinforced, no jurisdiction private land. So the next time an HOA caravan of cars rolled down my road, I was ready. Clay stepped out with his entourage, carrying rolled blueprints like they were marching into negotiations. I didn't say a word. I simply pulled the homemade steel gate across the road and locked it right in front of them. Clay stared at the padlock, stunned. "What do you think you're doing?" I replied calmly, "Preventing trespass." The woman with the clipboard nearly combusted. "You can't block access to community development." I raised my phone, already recording. "This isn't community property, this is my road. And you are now officially trespassing." Clay laughed under his breath. "You wouldn't dare pursue that," I smiled. "Watch me, because I wasn't just blocking a road. I was about to file criminal charges, and the regret on their faces was only going to grow. Word travels fast in rural communities, especially when it involves conflict, property lines, and outsiders wearing matching shirts. By the time the HOA filed their first complaint against me for obstruction, half the town already knew the story. People at the local diner joked that the fancy neighborhood up north was trying to annex my driveway like a miniature empire. The next step they took was bold a cease and desist letter claiming I was unlawfully restricting public access. Public. That word alone nearly made choke on the coffee I was drinking when I opened the envelope. The letter was printed on heavy cardstock, dripping with confidence that came from suburban legal committees and neighborhood Facebook group echo chambers. But what bothered me was the assumption they believed that printing something in a bold serif font made it true. I drafted my response in the most professional, artistically respectful way possible. I taped the cease and desist letter to a wooden stake, hammered it into the ground 10 feet from my property line, and attached a sign above it that read, "Return to sender." Not my problem. I thought maybe humor would cool tempers. It didn't. 3 days later, a county code enforcement officer showed up, a middle-aged man with large sunglasses and a nervous smile. He introduced himself as Travis O'Malley, not the sheriff, not a deputy, not anyone with real authority in this situation, just the guy stuck with driving around, ensuring sheds weren't too big, and people didn't build extra bathrooms without permits. "Ms. Willard," he said awkwardly, "I received a complaint from Deer Run Lakes that you're restricting a community access route." "It's a private road," I reminded him. "Completely on my land?" He scratched his head. "They said it's historically a throughway." That again." "Travis," I said, motioning him toward the porch. "Let me show you something." I brought out the old leather folder, the one labeled 1924 to 1968. Spread across the table were original deeds, land patents, notarized maps, and the contract from the logging company acknowledging temporary permission. Travis looked overwhelmed, flipping pages like he was skimming biblical scripture for answers. I'm not really the right guy to interpret all this," he admitted, "but I can confirm this is a lot of documentation." That's what I thought. He left, unsure and apologetic, but 2 days later, the sheriff himself arrived, hat in hand, calm and direct. Sheriff Price had been around long enough to know my grandfather and respect land that had generational roots. "Morning, Lena," he said. "Got an official request to inspect a dispute. Coffee?" I offered. He chuckled. "Maybe after?" I explained everything, start to finish. Price listened without interrupting. When I was done, he simply said, "I'll review the papers, but if what you showed Travis is real, They don't have jurisdiction to use, modify, or claim passage. Finally, someone talking sense. But if I thought sanity would end the conflict, I underestimated the HOA's fondness for delusion. Because the next move they made was unbelievable. They started using the road anyway. Sneaking, driving at night, sending landscapers at dawn. So one upgraded. I installed security cameras, motion activated, infrared, and unmistakably visible. I placed 2 new steel posts on either side of the gate, and across the front, I hung a sign so unambiguous a child could interpret it. Private property, nitrogen monoxide access. Trespassers will be prosecuted. That same afternoon, as if on cue, Clay and his crew pulled up again. They exited their SUVs looking offended that physical objects dared deny their presence. Clay shouted through the gate, "You're escalating." "No," I called back. "I'm protecting. You can't legally record us." One woman barked. I pointed at the bright yellow sticker under the camera. Audio and video surveillance in use. Clay puffed his chest. The HOA board unanimously voted that this route must remain open. I rested my arms on the gate. "Clay, you could vote that clouds are required to snow marshmallows. Doesn't make it reality." His jaw locked. "Fine, do it the hard way." They already were. But they didn't know I had just filed something far more powerful than a complaint. I had already submitted trespassing charges to the county backed with video evidence, historical records, and witness statements from contractors admitting that HOA directed them. The encounter ended with Clay turning red and storming back to his vehicle, kicking gravel like a frustrated child. The real shock came 3 days later when Sheriff Price returned, this time not to visit me. He went straight to the HOA clubhouse. The flashing red and blue lights reflected beautifully off their spotless entryway glass as officers stepped out with folders and warrants. The same people who stood on my road smog and certain looked out their clubhouse windows, now looking pale faces stretched with disbelief that the law didn't orbit their board meetings. I wasn't watching from afar. I was seated in my truck, parked comfortably at the top of my hill, camera recording. Because if they wanted documentation, I was now collecting it in HD, and the regret on their faces had finally begun. The HOA board may have been shocked seeing patrol cars outside their clubhouse, but their shock was nothing compared to their arrogance afterward. They held an emergency meeting that same night. Of course, I wasn't invited, though half the town streamed the drama as someone accidentally went live in their Facebook group. According to local rumor, Clay insisted I was bluffing, that the sheriff's visit was just protocol and charges wouldn't stick. They believed their influence outweighed paperwork, property deeds, and common sense. The next week, I received a letter, not from the HOA, from their attorney, a sleekly worded message dripping with passive-aggressive diplomacy. They proposed a compromise. I could allow road access, and they would consider offering compensation, with the price strangely unspecified. Their choice of words told me everything. They thought they were negotiating from a place of strength. I replied with a single line, "See you in court." Those 4 words hit harder than any paragraph of legal fluff. Within days, subpoenas went out. Their officers, board members, and even the clipboard woman were summoned to appear. Meanwhile, the sheriff finalized 3 formal trespass charges against them, 2 administrative citations, and 1 criminal misdemeanor. Against Clay personally, it turned out sneaking onto someone's property after being told not to is considered willful trespass. Imagine that. Court day arrived like a brewing thunderstorm. Dark clouds, heavy air, the kind of weather every farmer can smell trouble in. I walked into the county courthouse with a canvas folder under my arm, the same leather-bound records my grandfather kept. On the right side of the hall stood the HOA delegation in matching forest green shirts embroidered with their deer logo. Uniforms again, as if fabric stitching changed the law. Their attorney, slick silver hair, expensive briefcase, top dollar confidence, approached me with a rehearsed smile. "Ms. Willard," he greeted. "I believe this is all a misunderstanding. Perhaps we could—" "No," I answered before he finished. "We passed misunderstanding 3 months ago." He withdrew with a nod and a sigh. Inside the courtroom, the judge, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for smelling lies before they were spoken, called the case. Clay sat stiff in his chair, jaw clenched like the fate of the universe rested on his ego. The clipboard woman sat next to him, whispering nervously as though clutching a binder could deflect consequences. The attorney opened confidently. He argued that the road was historically accessed, that the community needed it, that I was being unreasonably restrictive. When he finished, he turned toward me with a smirk that practically said, "Top that." I stood, placed the leather folder on the table, and distributed copies, notarized, certified, stamped copies of every document supporting my claim. Then I spoke. "Judge, not only is the road privately owned, but the only historical use was under temporary contractual permission that expired decades ago. There is no easement. There is no clause. There's no implied access, and the HOA knew they didn't have it." I slid forward a USB stick. "And here is video evidence of multiple violations after the HOA was verbally and formally told not to enter." The judge examined the documents silently, flipping through them with the solemnity of someone reading a verdict already carved in stone. When she raised her eyes, the room quieted. "Mr. Foster," she said, addressing Clay, "did your organization continue to access this property after notice was given?" Clay swallowed hard. We understood it was." The judge raised a hand to stop him. "A yes or no will do." Clay's voice cracked. "Yes." From the gallery, someone coughed a berry laugh. The judge ruled swiftly. The HOA was found liable for trespass. Clay was individually charged with criminal trespass. A restraining order was granted preventing any HOA representative from entering my land. They were fined per incident. And the cherry on top, their attempted claim of necessity was dismissed as baseless. But the part that made headlines? The judge added in her closing statement, "Private ownership is not a suggestion. It is the cornerstone of law. A homeowners association has authority only where ownership exists, and Ms. Willard is not one of your homeowners." The courtroom erupted, not loudly, but with suppressed chuckles, whispered disbelief, and the quiet satisfaction of a story that would be retold across town for years. Clay's face lost its confident color, replaced with an expression I recognized well. Regret, the deep, bitter kind. And yet, the storm wasn't over. Because when people used to power lose publicly, they rarely walk away quietly. They regroup. They retaliate. They double down. And the HOA was about to make the biggest mistake of all. Court should have been the end of it, the logical end, but logic wasn't something the HOA operated on. They were fueled by pride, image, and the delusion that a committee with matching shirts could rewrite geography. After the ruling, word spread faster than wildfire. The diner regulars practically recited the judge's closing remarks like scripture. The story made it into the local paper, page 3, but still above the fold. And nothing bruises an HOA board more than public humiliation they can't file a complaint against. Clay didn't just lose in court, he lost respect, votes, and confidence. Residents questioned dues, authority, and why their money was being used to fight a road that didn't belong to them. But instead of accepting defeat, the board doubled down. They couldn't take the road, so they targeted the one thing they could influence: my reputation. The HOA started circulating rumors. They said I was unstable, aggressive, hostile toward community progress. One post online claimed, "I threatened children riding bikes, though not a single tire track ever touched my land." They painted me as a conspiracy-driven hermit guarding land out of spite. I could have ignored it, but rumor has a way of becoming shadow stains that stick to a name. There was one resident, though, Maya, a woman who lived on the far side of the development. She reached out cautiously, messaging me through social media. For what it's worth, not everyone supports what the board is doing. A lot of us didn't know the truth. We talked. She apologized for the rumors, confirmed the board manufactured half their panic stories during closed meetings. She also told me something far more concerning. The board was now discussing physical solutions. That wording chilled me more than threats on paper ever could. 2 weeks after the verdict, I woke at 5:48 a.m. to the sound of metal grinding. Not cars, not footsteps, metal. I slipped on boots and stepped onto my porch and froze. 2 men, not contractors, not HOA board members, were cutting the steel gate with a power saw. The sparks lit the dawn like angry orange fireflies. "Hey," I shouted, marching forward. "Step away from that gate." One man turned, masked, hood up, clearly not expecting confrontation this early. The other kept cutting like he was racing the clock. I recorded. My hands weren't shaking. My voice wasn't unsure. "You are committing property damage and criminal trespass," I said loudly and clearly. "Sheriff is 30 minutes away, but every second of this is being filmed." The saw stopped. The man holding it hesitated, then cursed, ripping off the mask. Clay, caught red-handed. He didn't look powerful now. Cheeks red, breath shaking, desperation visible in every movement. "Lena," he said through clenched teeth, "you're forcing our hand. The community needs this road. We can't let one person hold progress hostage. You're committing a crime," I said plainly. "That gate is an obstruction," he snapped. "That gate," I corrected, "is legal. Your presence here isn't." The second man removed his mask as well, someone I recognized only because Maya sent me board member photos. 2 grown adults caught vandalizing like teenagers spray painting a school. "You really think a camera is enough to stop us?" Clay muttered. "No," I replied, lifting another device, a phone with a blinking light. "But a live stream to the HOA's own community page might." Their blood drained. Clay lunged forward, trying to grab the phone, but I stepped back fast. One more step, and he would have crossed a new line. He stopped inches from me, too close, too reckless, too far gone. I called the sheriff. They knew the names. They had the footage. The deputies arrived faster than usual. Apparently, bored rural mornings turn exciting when HOA drama evolves into sabotage. Clay was arrested, not escorted, not warned, arrested. Resisting? Yes. Apologizing? No. The second man was detained as well. The saw lay abandoned in the dirt like a weapon left by a defeated soldier. I stood watching as the same sheriff cars that once parked outside their clubhouse now drove them away in the opposite direction. As they left, Sheriff Price turned to me and said, "Some people only understand fences when they're behind one, but this arrest created something else, something far outside the HOA's control. Their own residents turned on them. Fees, dues, finances, people began questioning everything. Why were thousands spent on court battles? Why was private property treated as public entitlement? Why were board members cutting gates at dawn like burglars? Clay's downfall wasn't the court ruling. It was exposure, the kind that no rumor could rewrite. But the story wasn't over because the HOA wasn't just falling apart. It was about to implode from the inside. After the Dawn Gate incident, the mood in Deer Run Lake shifted faster than anyone could have predicted. Residents who once nodded politely at board meetings began asking questions, demanding receipts, minutes, and explanations for fees spent on intimidation rather than infrastructure. Emails flooded the HOA as inbox polite inquiries at first, then sharply worded complaints. People who had remained silent suddenly realized the so-called authority was hollow. Clay Foster, once the confident president with a polished smile, was now a liability. The arrest footage went viral in the local community. Even neighboring towns heard of the HOA tried to cut a private gate at Dawn Story. The board members scrambled, trying to salvage reputation with emergency meetings and vague press releases, but their words fell flat. The residents weren't buying it anymore. One night, Maya, who had been quietly assisting me, sent me a text with a photo attached. It showed a series of internal emails between board members, detailing plans not only to use my road, but also to intimidate other homeowners who had questioned their decisions. There were notes about sending contractors to block private driveways, planting rumors about property owners, and even discussing filing false violations. The audacity of it was staggering, but the proof was concrete. I forwarded the evidence to Sheriff Price and the county prosecutor. They reviewed the emails carefully, and the legal team finally agreed there was enough to launch an investigation into fraud, harassment, and conspiracy to commit trespass. This wasn't just a property dispute anymore, it had escalated to criminal behavior with multiple actors involved. Meanwhile, back in the HOA, internal strife erupted. Board members began turning on one another. Some were worried about personal liability. Others tried to resign quietly, but Clay insisted everyone stay united, claiming they could weather the storm. His confidence had become desperation. One meeting, supposedly private, was accidentally live-streamed, capturing him yelling at the secretary about loyalty and obedience, while residents watched, horrified. The cumulative pressure forced the board into emergency elections. Many longtime residents nominated themselves to replace the board members, citing years of abuse and mismanagement. The vote was decisive. Clay and his inner circle were ousted, their names removed from all official records, and their ability to influence HOA actions effectively terminated. Meanwhile, I reinforced my gate and property boundaries, though at this point, the forest around my cabin seemed to echo the quiet justice that had settled over Halton Lane. I continued to work on the land, planting trees, clearing brush, and repairing sections of the driveway damaged during the failed gate-cutting attempt. Life had returned to normal, but with a new layer of vigilance. What struck me most during this chaos was the change in the community. People began communicating honestly, offering help, and looking out for one another instead of blindly following a board. Maya and I became unlikely allies, sharing knowledge about property rights and ways to maintain security. Other residents reached out, asking for guidance on documenting disputes and protecting their own property. What had started as a single land dispute had evolved into a movement for awareness, accountability, and community empowerment. By the time the prosecutor's office finished the preliminary investigation, charges were filed against multiple HOA members, including Clay. The courtroom again became a stage, but this time it wasn't me alone. It was truth, evidence, and the law holding authority figures accountable. And while the process was not easy, the victory felt enduring because it wasn't just about one gate or one road. It was about ensuring that power could not be abused without consequence. Even weeks later, whenever a neighbor drove past my property, they waved, smiled, and occasionally said, "Glad someone stood up." The forest had regained its rhythm, and Halton Lane was peaceful once more. But the lesson lingered. Unchecked authority always finds resistance, and sometimes resistance comes in the form of quiet persistence backed by facts and law. The HOO had learned a hard truth, one that wouldn't be forgotten. Months passed, and the aftermath of the HOA debacle slowly settled into the rhythm of ordinary life. Clay Foster and several board members faced formal charges for trespassing, harassment, and conspiracy. The court proceedings were methodical, with every email, video clip, and documented trespass presented as evidence. For the first time, the HOA had to answer not just to the community, but to the law itself. Watching the judge review the evidence, hearing the gavel fall on judgments against the very people who once believed they could intimidate me, was a quiet satisfaction that never needed fanfare. Justice, measured and deliberate, had a way of silencing arrogance in ways arguments and warnings never could. Back on Halton Lane, life returned to the serenity I had always valued. The cameras remained just in case, but their purpose now was a formality. The gate stood firmly, an unspoken promise to anyone who might consider testing boundaries. I worked the land, repaired the small creek bridge, and planted wildflowers along the driveway. Each project became a meditation, a reminder that stewardship was about care, not control. Maya and a few other residents would occasionally stop by, sharing advice, lending tools, or simply enjoying the shade of the pines. Friendships, once tentative because of fear of HOA retaliation, grew steadily, rooted in trust and mutual respect. The new HOA board, composed of residents who had resisted the previous board's tyranny, began functioning differently. Policies were transparent, meetings were recorded, and no one attempted to extend authority beyond what was legally theirs. Residents felt heard, and the sense of community was slowly restored without the constant shadow of intimidation. The contrast between old and new leadership was stark. One relied on fear, the other on collaboration. And in quiet moments on my porch, I realized that the difference wasn't just governance, it was integrity. Even Clay's departure left a lingering lesson. The man who once sneered at deeds and boundaries now faced the consequences of assuming influence without legitimacy. Reports of his mismanagement and trespass were circulated to neighboring HOAs as cautionary examples, a real-life warning that authority unbacked by law and respect could collapse spectacularly. Rumors of him attempting to regain influence were swiftly silenced by official notices and legal documentation, leaving his ambitions effectively grounded. I sometimes thought about my grandfather during these weeks. I imagined him sitting in his old study, pipe in hand, smiling quietly as I navigated the paperwork, the boundaries, and the law. He had prepared me for this fight without ever knowing it. The decades of meticulous record-keeping, the care given to every deed and survey, the insistence that ownership was sacred, they all culminated in a moment where history, law, and persistence converged to protect what was mine. Ultimately, the battle wasn't about victory over Clay or the HOA. It was about preserving the principles that land ownership represented. Private property wasn't just a fence, a gate, or a driveway. It was the autonomy to live without interference, the right to protect what generations before had fought for, and the responsibility to act when others tried to undermine it. Halton Lane became more than a road. It was a symbol of boundaries respected, of vigilance rewarded, and of patience proving more powerful than intimidation. As the last of the court proceedings concluded, I walked down the lane at sunrise, the mist rising from the creek and the dew glistening on wildflowers. No vehicles disturbed the gravel, no voices challenged the calm, and the only sounds were the wind and the soft chirping of birds. It felt finally like home. Peace wasn't just restored, it was earned. The story of how the HOA tried, failed, and faced consequences spread across town, not as gossip, but as a lesson. Residents learned that standing firm, documenting every step, and invoking the law when necessary was not just effective, it was essential. My cameras, my deeds, and my resolve had done more than protect a private road. They had reshaped the understanding of what it meant to respect property, authority, and community. Halton Lane remained mine. The land thrived, the forests whispered, and the echoes of conflict faded into memory. But the lesson endured. Those who believe power is given by position will always falter against those who know power comes from law, clarity, and courage. And in the quiet aftermath, as I locked the gate for the last time that evening, I smiled, knowing that peace, once earned, is the sweetest kind there is.